Hello, I'm Wendy Leeds-Hurwitz, and before I start, I'd like to thank Professor Shanbo for permitting me to participate in this conference without actually getting to Wuhan. The title of my talk is The Influence of National Character Studies on Intercultural Communication, Moving Beyond Past Assumptions to Current Complexities. This conference calls for discussion of national image construction. Given globalization, the views one country has of others matters a great deal. And so this is a worthy topic for consideration. As my contribution to the conversation, I'd like to consider an earlier phrase, national character studies. This earlier set of studies is significant given the substantial overlaps in the content considered by each, and given the influence of national character across several disciplines, but especially on the development of intercultural communication. The same issue of cross-cultural understanding is central to both, and so it's obvious why intercultural communication scholars initially took on some of the assumptions and methods and theories of national character studies. Yet while overgeneralizations, such as the idea that cultural and national boundaries are identical, may be essential in times of war, they're no longer appropriate once war is over and should be questioned. The term national character is an old phrase, having been around at least a few hundred years. Barker provides a striking set of metaphors, calling national character a mental organization, connecting the minds of all the members of a national community by ties and connections as fine as silk and as firm as steel. This is a vivid image. The question remains whether it's true or not, but certainly it accurately represents what many of those who've used the term intend to describe. Anthropologists expanded national character to national character studies, the primary method of anthropology's ethnography, requiring direct observation of interaction after traveling to visit and document a wide variety of cultures. During World War II, American anthropologists were unable to engage in their traditional international fieldwork and thus had to invent new ways to use their expertise in culture. Of the 300 anthropologists in the U.S. at the time, all but a half dozen were involved in some aspects of the war effort. Margaret Mead is the best known of this group and the most influential. As the common root culture in their names shows, cultural anthropology and intercultural communication study overlapping topics, despite the fact that they have surprisingly few organizational overlaps. In 1940, Mead, together with then-husband Gregory Bateson, strove to find ways to explain a culture in abstractions that were both theoretically satisfying to themselves and of potential use to the war effort, and began to talk about national character. Bateson wrote the first publication to put forward the term in 1942, although Mead had used it earlier in a 1940 memo. Her adoption of the oversimplification of national character for particular culture, such as that of the Americans, was motivated by her desire to apply anthropological thinking to problems of national morale and a shorthand for enabling comparisons of and analyses of interactions between multiple cultures in transnational settings. Hennessy points out both the advantage and the disadvantage of the term. The idea of national character appears to be a necessary shorthand, loaded, like all necessary shorthands, with much potential for abuse. Despite this, national character was the dominant focus of American anthropology throughout the 1940s. Three overlapping concepts were integral to this strand of research: culture and personality, national character, and culture at a distance studies. Culture and personality refers to a combination of anthropological and psychological insights developed in the 1920s, largely under the direction of Edward Sapir, which later led to psychological anthropology. National character studies combined a background of culture and personality research with immediate wartime needs. As explained by Mead, the term national character was traditionally applied rather loosely to the body of writing that sought to interpret the people of a nation as distinguished from their history, literature, arts, or philosophy. Ruth Benedict felt war made the study of national character a matter of grave, practical importance. This was the first time anthropologists had attempted to study entire nations rather than so-called simple societies. National character studies then spawned culture at a distance projects, through which anthropologists, who were being kept at a literal distance due to war, began to study culture by interviewing recent immigrants as well as analyzing cultural and media products. These projects involved different researchers at different points of time, but primarily Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, Gregory Bateson, Rhoda Metro, Jeffrey Gorer, Lee Herring, and Clyde Cluckhone. The classic published example is Benedict's study of Japan, the chrysanthemum and the sword. National character studies documented typical norms of interaction and values within a single nation at a time. This made sense. If the research was to have political value, studies of nation-states were the most useful. National character studies influenced later research within intercultural communication, which often documented behavior and assumptions for members of a single culture at a time, maintaining the assumption that each culture was assumed to have boundaries coterminous with a single country. As Benedict stated, I believe that by serious study of learned cultural behavior, we could achieve a better international understanding and make fewer mistakes in international communication. A later goal was to describe areas of agreement which can be used as background for the acceptance of differences, more directly foreshadowing investigations of intercultural encounters. So what are the connections between studies by a group of anthropologists during World War II and intercultural communication as practiced today? Mead described the work by anthropologists in the 40s as being required by the urgent need to devise better methods of cooperation between national groups and within national groups which are torn by regional, class, or ideological conflicts. Towards that goal, the studies utilized research methods at least some intercultural communication scholars still rely on today. Informant interviews, life histories, especially of recent immigrants, studies of fiction and films produced within a culture, study of oral narratives produced within a culture, and analyzing interaction patterns, including gender roles and parent-child interactions. In addition to research methods, there are other common theoretical concepts beyond national character, the most important of which is culture. The idea of culture was and still is one of the cornerstones of intercultural communication. Mead defined this as the total shared learned behavior of a society or a subgroup. This definition is likely acceptable to a majority of intercultural communication scholars today. Some basic assumptions are also shared. Specifically, members of both groups take for granted that all cultural behavior is mediated by human beings who not only hear and speak and communicate through words, but use their senses in ways that are equally systematic to see and to project what they see in concrete forms, in design, costume, architecture, to communicate through the mutual perception of visual images, to taste and smell and pattern their capabilities to taste and smell, so the traditional cuisine of a people can be as distinctive and as organized as a language. It's further a basic assumption of both groups of scholars that every human being embodies in an individual form the culture or cultures within which he or she have been reared and in which they live. In addition, the value of applied research seemed obvious to both groups. National character studies were an early test of how well anthropological concepts could explain real, modern-day problems of interaction between members of different cultural groups. Intercultural communication often considers the practical application of cultural understanding. So it's no surprise that early practitioners relied upon previously existing examples. National character studies are virtually never named in intercultural communication writings, but they had substantial impact on the assumptions of Edward Hall, an anthropologist working with many of these others in the late 1940s and 50s, who then influenced the assumptions of other later scholars. Early intercultural communication research, at least into the 1990s, and some of the current work as well, frequently accepts that each country has a typical set of patterns of communication and values available for description. Hofstede, for example, adapted the concept of national character for comparative studies of employees within a multinational organization. Using different vocabulary, but maintaining the assumption that nation and culture are coterminous. Scholars in the early days of intercultural communication did not, as we do today, seek to understand the multiple constituent groups living in each country or across national boundaries, let alone study the cosmopolitans who move easily between cultures and countries. Rather, each country was seen as a monolithic whole. While national character studies made sense in the early days of understanding other groups, today intercultural communication scholars recognize each country as heterogeneous rather than homogeneous, and acknowledge that individuals have multiple cultural identities rather than only one. The easy match between culture and nation is now outdated, a fact many people have noted. Skolin, and Jones go even further, arguing that culture is a verb, given that cultural identity displays are flexible and must be carefully matched to context. Despite the number of times this has been pointed out, the assumption that each country can appropriately be described as having a single culture has not been questioned often enough within intercultural communication. Scholars must separate political and popular equations of nation and culture from their own research into subtler distinctions between the various cultural groups living within each nation. It may be useful to distinguish three types of studies conducted by intercultural researchers. These have the same logical and chronological order, that is, the simplest occurred first. So they may be viewed as a series of stepping stones required for intercultural understanding. The first step is to learn about and describe norms of behavior within individual cultural groups as an obvious necessity for each new group encountered. The second step is to compare norms and behaviors across cultural groups, also certainly necessary in order to achieve understanding. The third and final step is to understand interactions between members of different cultural groups. Thus, the first of these steps gathers basic knowledge, the second involves cross-cultural comparison, and the third stands at the heart of intercultural communication. This distinction between cross-cultural and intercultural communication has by now been widely accepted by those who study intercultural communication. Despite this general acceptance, however, surprisingly often, cross-cultural and intercultural are used as synonyms, which only confuses matters. National character studies nearly always stopped at the first step, synthesizing and analyzing information about behavior within a politically relevant selection of nations. While this choice might have been reasonable in the 40s given wartime constraints, accepting such a limitation certainly is less reasonable today, having substantially more knowledge now and given ready access to more cultural groups. Romani put it this way: the careless use of terms like national identity in many textual contexts has always puzzled me. How can educated people refer to such an inherently vague conundrum, a generalization which irresponsibly overlooks class and group distinctions? The matter becomes even more problematic when the boundaries of cultures are carelessly assumed to match national boundaries, not just among the general public, but also by intercultural communication scholars who certainly know better. My suggestion here is not to imply that there's anything wrong with past research. Those choices have already been made and presumably seemed reasonable at the time. My goal is rather to highlight what has been done so it becomes easier to move beyond outdated limits to more sophisticated and subtle research, acknowledging and accounting for the complexity that exists in the real world. Most countries are large and diverse, with only a very few commonalities across all the citizens. Certainly these are worth documenting, but stopping there means that the subtler complexity citizens themselves have to manage in their everyday lives remains unexamined. It's through knowing our own past history that we learn to name the assumptions that we take for granted, to discover their origin, and then update them as necessary for present circumstances. National character studies were, even in original conception, quite interdisciplinary. Perhaps due to this, even after anthropologists stopped using the term national character, the concept went on to be used within psychology, sociology, political science, business and technology, comparative literature, and the intelligence community. It's not just a wide range of disciplines that have adopted national character studies. Other countries beyond the US and the UK have done so as well. For example, studies of the Japanese national character became a large dynamic discourse in Japan, just as they were declining in America. As a brief survey of current literature suggests, far from being uniformly rejected as inadequate or incomplete approach, most recently national character has been described as a re-emerging paradigm and now updated by changing it to the national habitus. A warning bell should sound every time the entire population of large multi-ethnic countries is grouped together as having a single culture for ease of analysis, whether or not the term used is national character. In conclusion, national character studies substantially influenced the development of intercultural communication. In the early 1940s, Mead and other anthropologists were responding to a major crisis, a world war. They did what they could to help out, but in the process laying the groundwork for what developed into intercultural communication. At the same time, national character studies were flawed from the start, inviting criticism because they were based on literary sources and the memories of expatriates rather than fieldwork. Given this, why would communication scholars adopt the same techniques without question? At least part of the answer may be that not enough people stop to think carefully about the implications of some of their choices. National character has influenced current research in intercultural communication by playing a role in a variety of assumptions taken for granted today. These include not only theory, the concept of culture, and method, relying on culture at a distance techniques, but also a goal, the importance of applied research. However, the central assumption that a culture and a nation have the same boundaries has had the most unwelcome influence, since scholars now recognize each country as heterogeneous rather than homogeneous. Nationality in itself is a bad index of cultural identity. The assumption that each person has one culture, speaks one language, is no longer true in our global multicultural world, if indeed it ever was. Many scholars have documented the various ways in which identities are ever so much more complex and multiple than we used to assume. And in the paper, I've described an awful lot of this. Intercultural communication scholars who talk about co-cultures, third cultures, multiple identities, multilingualism, the marginality of the multicultural, reconceptualizing identity, hybridity, cosmopolitanism, social construction of identity, still all too often design research projects as if national identity were stable, singular, and simple, rather than dynamic, heterogeneous, and complex. Equating culture with nation leaves researchers unable to address new forms of globalization, transnationalism, and cosmopolitanism. National character studies were intended as research on practical problems. Like other applied investigations, it's important to understand the context within which this form was invented and the limits of that context to serve as a model today. As early as 1953, it was pointed out by Mandelbaum that anthropology developed as the study of small groups, so applications of character studies to nations limited the applicability of what had been previously learned. It's one thing to assume that wartime needs trumped scientific attention to detail and accuracy, but once war was over, the value of national character as a concept should have been questioned, not only by anthropologists as it was, but by researchers in other disciplines as oddly it was not, rather than adapted as a useful tool. There's nothing wrong with documenting what happens in one culture at a time. Equally, there's nothing inappropriate about comparing what happens across two or more cultures. However, I would argue that it is long past time to move beyond the simplistic equation of nation and culture to a more adequate understanding of the true complexity of our multicultural cities, where people frequently move between countries, whether by choice or an attempt to flee war for safe harbor, taking their cultural assumptions with them. As a result, children may be born in one culture, raised in a second, and live in a third. Today, most organizations are international by virtue of their employees, even if they're not formally multinational corporations. We do ourselves no favors if we stop with the easy comparison of two or more national cultures, ignoring the more complex understanding that people and nations have multiple, heterogeneous, plural identities, and they can shift gracefully between these at need. Intercultural scholars often state, but need to actually study that multiplicity, that complexity in order to understand how participants can gracefully negotiate between identities, rather than stopping at the level of cross-cultural comparisons that inaccurately assume everyone who shares a passport shares all significant elements of a culture. The goal must be to move beyond earlier findings. We still know too little about how to raise children, educate students, conduct business, or integrate new immigrants in a truly global, multicultural world. And we know far too little about how individuals manage the multiple cultural identities as they move between contexts and cross cultural borders, national and otherwise. Intercultural communication should be at the forefront of such studies. In sum, we must stop making the outdated assumption that nation and culture are equivalent while keeping the best of what national character studies showed us. Not only that culture is relevant to international relations, but that applied and interdisciplinary research have value for global communication. Thus, we must begin to walk the talk of the multiplicity approach, as Verdurin suggests.